right, time for my weekly check-in on Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk, which I'm doing as a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac. This week it is Chapter 6, Canada, the Northwest, and the Treaty Period, 1869 to 76. And so this is, we're heading down to, I guess, the wire. Within a decade, the bison are going to be gone. The indigenous people of the plains are going to be marginalized by the new political and economic reality. So this is the time when we need especially on the indigenous side, there is a real urge, a real need. We need to set up the treaties. We need to get something set up to support our peoples and to convert over to this new economy that is coming, because the native peoples, for the most part, this isn't like, oh, romantic, we're going to hold to the old ways to the end. It's like, no, these are sensible people going, hey, shit, we need to shift over. There's going to be a shit ton of immigrants going to be coming in. We've already seen them coming in to our lands. We need to set up a treaty thing to try and successfully survive and become a part of this new economy. At the same time, and this is also in the context of the HBC has the HBC has sold its monopoly. There's no longer a monopoly. It's sold it to the Canadian government, the new Canadian government. They no longer control the region. They're no longer feel it's incumbent upon them to make provisions for their employees, the native peoples of these lands. The HBC basically had sort of their own sort of system of a social support system. There was store credit that native peoples had, so you could borrow stuff to get yourself through when times were lean, and then you could repay it when you were able to bring in goods. Also, the HBC did vaccination programs that actually ameliorated some of the really terrible epidemics that tore through these regions. I mean, still tons and tons of indigenous people died, but it actually kind of arrested it. A lot of the stuff coming out from the States got arrested by the HBC. A lot of that falls away, and what we find is that the Dominion of Canada, the new Dominion of Canada, doesn't have the infrastructure, has no idea of the size of the magnitude of the problem, it's just like, and it just moves super slow. By the time they actually appoint a board of health thing to actually kind of organize a response, the freaking smallpox epidemic is already over. This is also a time when, with the power vacuum, the Americans are coming in, especially Fort Benton on the Missouri River, Fort Whoop Up, because it was basically a real den, apparently, of selling alcohol, fire water, just fucking what sounds like a horrible concoction that was being sold to the natives. They're on the Missouri River, and they brought it up into the plains, the Canadian plains. Like once the HBC was gone, there wasn't people there to enforce, hey, you're not gonna be here. This vacuum, they brought that up. They brought up a ton of disease because the Missouri is now getting lots of steamships on it, so you're getting more and more people. There's just such an explosion of the immigration that is happening below with the gold rush and things like that. Like Montana becomes a state. It's like it's like there's a ton of people down there, and they're bringing up. Whenever there's something like, oh, immigrants are coming to settle the land, that also means they're all bringing their diseases with them, which are maybe not as lethal to the immigrants, but they're super lethal to the native thing. So, and it was interesting in this section that there was a talk about the difference between how the Catholic and Protestant missionaries dealt with when there was an outbreak. That the Protestants would get everyone to disperse, while the Catholics were all about, oh, we'll bring the community together. And indeed, they saw the Protestant idea of like dispersing, getting away, as cowardice. Except you think about it now, that's basically what we're doing. We're being cowardly leftists by all kind of sheltering in place and not gathering together in mass groups. Well, I guess we are on both sides of both sides of the political spectrum, but it's not the ideal way to deal with an epidemic. And I mean, coronavirus is one thing. Smallpox epidemic is just like bazillion times magnitudes of lethality more. So yeah, at the same time, the Canadian government also did stuff like basically they basically cordoned off the area, wouldn't let anyone in or out, which ended up causing more starvation. Like the people who survived the disease ended up starving. There's more starvation because there wasn't any supplies going in. They also stopped the fur trade, which again is that same stuff. By June 1871, the disease finally did disappear. Now there's just like a lot of pressure from the First Nations to get these treaties going. They needed assistance in these areas. And they also were just really aware of, like, in 1871, there's a super flood of Ontario immigrants overwhelming the Manitoba provincial authorities, and indeed not the natives' pressure, but it was this flood of immigrants that actually caused the Canadian government to finally force them to complete Treaty Number 1. But they were only the government would only negotiate once they were forced to, because of the pressure for development from the settlers, from the whites, which think about a lot of stuff of how the Canadian government still deals with anything that is any First Nations issues. It's like, the pressure, they can get pressured by small groups, but it has to be massive group pressure before they finally will kind of do stuff. So yeah, it's like, we also have in this section them talking about the coming of the railway. Like we have the first kind of surveyors for the railway expedition, where you have a guy called Grant who's like along with, and he's looking at the situation, and he's like predicting basically the demise of all the indigenous people here at the hands of the American traders coming up, because of just all the havoc that they seem to be wreaking. I mean, there is also a lot of like, oh, we're going to blame the Americans for all the bad stuff that's happening, and not like, the Canadians participants in massacres like the Cypress Hill massacre, which did have actually Canadian perpetrators as well as American perpetrators. But actually, it's interesting. Dashchuk says that this was actually maybe prevented by the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police in 1874, kind of enforcing Canadian sovereignty on an area that was getting flooded with lawless, crazy Americans and stuff like that, which so that tamped things down a bit. So which is and so we also have. But at the same time, it's like the Canadians were pushing ahead on certain things. It's like at the conclusion of the Coppell Treaty in 1874, at the ceremony, the people there lambasted the Canadian officials for allowing the surveys to happen without actually having the surrender of the Aboriginal title. And the chief at the time saying they're like, look, you got this amount of money for selling our land. We want that money. So a lot of this stuff happening. But you have like the Cree leadership, thought it's like, it's like a successful treaty was the best chance of survival. I mean, there's a lot of people, there was definitely a lot of tensions and a lot of people going like, well, we should just band together and we should just kill them all and push them out. And it's like, the leadership is like, that's just not going to happen. We are so decimated, so weakened. that at this point our best chance of survival is to try and negotiate a treaty that will help us transition. Um, there's a thing here of I have to look up his name, look up who this guy is. Morris. He said, like, he refused the idea of like a food aid promise because it would lead to idleness amongst the indigenous people covered under treaties. And he said, like, the Native people are like, look, we're not asking for handouts. We don't want to become just supported by the Canadian government. What we're looking for is, at times of hardship, in drought and diseases, that we get assistance. And Morris is like, oh, we won't allow you to like die like dogs, but didn't put anything in the treaty except for a mention of, the government of Canada will provide a medicine chest. But it's one of these phrases that gets interpreted different ways on different sides. Maybe the Native peoples at the time were told that the medicine chest meant this, but later we get really crappy interpretations of what medicine chest means. You get the Cree with Treaty 6 saying, like, we want assistance to convert to agriculture. We know that the bison trade, that all that stuff, that is dying. That is the old fur trade system. That is gone, and there's going to be a new economic system here, and it's going to be agriculture, and we want to convert to that. And we're going to have something like the medicine chest, which is this idea like of the HBC, of how this 200-year tradition that the natives and whites had under the HBC of kind of a social support system of them providing assistance, providing credit, providing vaccinations in times of disease that the HBC did. We want that under this new Canadian system as well, in exchange for you are getting to settle people on our lands. So the Native people really, they saw all this coming. And they knew that, like, this increase of immigration these waves of immigrants coming across the thing to a Native person, what that meant was more disease carriers. So we're going to need medical assistance. We know we can't stop all these people coming into our lands, but we need medical assistance for the disease that they're going to bring to our people, and all that. And so they signed these treaties. And maybe they didn't see, or maybe it was just like, this is our best chance. They didn't see like how miserly the Canadian government was going to be in interpreting these terms of this treaty, following the death of the bison and the marginalization, and how marginalized they were going to be from this new agricultural economy. It's one of these things, if you get the sense, like, if this treaty had been formed, there would have been a lot more medical assistance for the continuing epidemics and everything happening, and we wouldn't have Native peoples on reservations in shitty little places with no drinking water. We would have Native farmers who would be, a part of that the Canadian breadbasket economy going forward. So it's interesting. I've been reading this in conjunction with reading the Canadian History for Dummies by, God damn it, his name just goes out of my head every time I talk about this. We're just going to go with the Will Ferguson, his Canadian History for Dummies, which is it's a very basic, very much a history of Canada told from the white settler point of view, with a few slices here's Native view coming in, but now this Clearing the Plains book has trained me. It's like every time I see, and then plucky settlers flooded into an area, into the Caribou or stuff like that, I think, plucky disease carriers flooded in and carried disease and which killed more and more Native peoples. Which just a little side note, there's talk about like smallpox blankets, the idea of the white colonists having blankets covered with smallpox and giving it to Native peoples is sort of a kind of a more conspiracy theory idea of how Native people were killed, exterminated from their land. I think I don't doubt that there might have been uh, individual circumstances of that. However, I just think on an epidemiological level, it's like it was far more deadly that 5,000 white settlers came into an area and interacted with native peoples. That's far more deadly than a couple of smallpox blankets. So it's one of those really shitty, terrible things of history. Now, how the Canadian government and the HBC before it exploited and failed to give assistance to and failed to integrate these people into the new economy, that we will be, I'm sure, talking about in later chapters. There was also an interesting thing with the Canadian History for Dummies, the idea of this period is the shift from mercantilism to kind of a freer trade, kind of proto-modern capitalism. Don't quote me on that because I'm not anything into economics